éblouissant. Mais on peut encore le comparer au centre de prescription d'opiacés diversifiés en Suisse, et c'est encore plus éblouissant, le contraste. OK, 5 minutes. Alors je parle en anglais, et j'arriverai à le faire. In my new field work in Philadelphia, I unfortunately was able to document from the inside the abusive form that drug arrests take on a routine Saturday night. I was picked up on a raid of drugs on the drug-selling corner that I'm studying, in which several street sellers were arrested, but so were several neighborhood youth who were simply hanging out, bored, passing the time, chit-chatting with me. In fact, at the time I was tape recording stories of police brutality. I spent the next 18 hours in a precinct holding cell, waiting to be arraigned before a judge and forbidden from making any phone calls. Over half of the 36 other men and women who were arrested that same night and held in these precinct cells belonged in the hospital, not in a jail cell, including, unfortunately, me, because the police had taken the opportunity, when they had handcuffed me face down on the ground, to kick me like a football, just for fun. This fractured my ribs, I found out later when I was released and paid, because in the US it's so expensive, several $100s to have my ribs x-rayed in a hospital emergency room afterwards. But my cellie, as the person who shares your cell is called in the prison, patois, was in much worse shape than I. He had been in jail for 16 hours, and he was in acute opiate withdrawal. He was throwing up in the filthy toilet that we shared in the cell that had been designed for one person, so there was not room for 2 people to lie down at the same time. But that is par for the course in the unsanitary, dangerous overcrowding caused by the war on drugs. He had nothing left inside him, just dry heaves at that point, moaning and shivering, because mysteriously, or not so mysteriously, the guards keep the temperature at 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius in the Philadelphia holding cells by over-air conditioning them. And I'm told by the guards that this makes the inmates more obedient and calmer. In the cell next to me, a man who was throwing up even more violently, after several hours of horrible gut-wrenching noises, starts shouting out in between sobs to anyone who will listen. What am I supposed to do? What can I do? Another voice shouts back across the hallway, knock yourself out. Then all of a sudden I start hearing bang, bang, bang. He did this about 6 times, throwing his head against the fiberglass walls of our cells until he gave up, moaning, I can't, I'm not strong enough. He's answered, come on, you can do it, be strong. Then bang, bang, bang. This banging is interrupted by screaming and running down the opposite hallway as a bevy of guards invade his cell 3 doors down from me. From their conversation, it sounds like an inmate has slashed his wrists. Through the walls of my cell, I hear one of the guards chuckling to another as they walk down the hallway to the central office. He is one very sick individual. The other guard adds, also with levity, well, now he's not going to get anything. We're not even going to let there be any tops on his wooders. Apparently, this inmate had attempted to slash his wrists with the top of the water bottles that they gave us once a day. Another friendlier guard asks, how bad is it? And the loudmouth joking guard responds dismissively, it's not too bad, just a lot of bleeding. Coincidentally, when I was finally released 18 hours later, I was released with this, quote, very sick individual who had attempted suicide, and he was very sick. He had some bloody gauze taped around his wrists. I'm not medically trained, but if any of us saw him on the street, we would immediately identify him as seriously, organically, mentally ill. He couldn't hold his head still, and he smiled inappropriately, making naive statements to the guards, to the judge who released him, and to me, as I was trying to persuade him to come with me to the emergency room, that I would take him with me to the emergency room for him to get his medications, because he had been saying that it had been over 24 hours since he'd taken his medications. And he answers obediently as we're stepping out, yeah, I better go to the hospital before I do something bad to myself. He was someone that was easy to deal with, relatively. But as soon as we stepped out onto the street, a white cigarette butt in the gutter caught his attention, and he pounced on it, thinking it was a piece of crack that someone had dropped. And that's behavior among chronic crack smokers that's common on those that are especially chronic. It's called doing the chicken, as they repeatedly pick at pebbles and pieces of garbage in the hopes that they're finding discarded pieces of crack. My attempts to remind him firmly, "Come on, let me take you to the hospital," causes him to pause and politely announce to me, in his extraordinarily naive and bizarrely gentle way, that a doctor recently told me can be characteristic of adults who've suffered from fetal alcohol syndrome. "Nah, I think I have something else I want to do." And he runs off in the direction of the corners where crack is sold. In conclusion, very briefly, I think there's tremendous potential for the public health field to redress the imbalance between law enforcement and health in the provisions of services to vulnerable populations. The United States is a model for how to waste immense amounts of funds on the war on drugs to no rational avail. The challenge is to carve back out for public health the institutional and service spaces that have been taken away from health over the last 20 years of zero tolerance in the war on drugs, and redress the distortions imposed in our own service delivery programs in public health by zero tolerance policies creeping in and distorting our relations with participants. There is also a tremendous amount of room for direct collaboration, which I've seen, and I'll end with this, in San Francisco, where the city managed to pass an ordinance that forced the police to bring anyone into the hospital who had a visible medical problem. And they enforced it by not giving raises to the police if they had too many reports of someone later having to be transferred to the hospital. And it completely transformed police user relationships on the street, and actually forced a lot of users to go into treatment and to get access to services. And we actually saw this taking place in our social network. It happened towards the end.
À peu près une quinzaine, et on a bénéficié en plus de beaucoup de conseils de collègues étrangers. Je pense à Marie-Jeanne Krieg et à d'autres, à doctoresse Minot en Suisse et beaucoup d'autres collègues étrangers. Alors en fait, l'objectif de Bernard Kouchner était un peu plus vaste. Il était de mettre un peu d'ordre, en fait, dans la distinction dénuée de sens entre drogue dure illicite, dont la consommation, la détention, etc., étaient soumises à la loi de 1970, et les drogues dites douces, dont la consommation, y compris abusive, était licite, car considérée, à tort bien entendu, on le sait maintenant, comme peu dangereuse et peu addictive. In fine, l'idée du ministre était de promouvoir un vrai débat au Parlement sur la loi de 1970 qui pouvait aller jusqu'à l'emprisonnement des consommateurs, elle existe toujours, des drogues illicites, laissant à la réglementation ordinaire la consommation des produits illicites, alcool, tabac, médicaments du système nerveux central, etc. Nous avons pris en compte la dangerosité pour le système nerveux central, et vous voyez qu'il est résumé, cette dangerosité, est résumée en dessous. Elle est analysée post-mortem sur des tissus. Donc, est-ce que les neurones sont lésés ou pas lésés chez les consommateurs de drogue. Les marqueurs gliaux, ça va avec le premier thème. La neuroimagerie qui progressait de plus en plus. Et enfin, les analyses comportementales. Et quelquefois, on nous a reproché de ne pas prendre en compte le comportement, ce qui est faux, puisque, au contraire, on discutait très souvent du comportement dans ce rapport. Ensuite, la dangerosité individuelle, bien entendu, qui du reste peut varier d'un individu à l'autre. Là encore, on en a parlé ce matin. La dangerosité interindividuelle, c'est-à-dire la dangerosité de quelqu'un qui est addict vis-à-vis de personnes de son entourage. Et enfin, la toxicité générale, je n'ai pas besoin de vous dire, le tabac, le cancer du poumon, l'alcool, les maladies cardiovasculaires, etc. Avec 3 groupes comme ça. Le groupe numéro 1, héroïne, crack, alcool. Le second, cocaïne, amphétamine, ecstasy, hallucinogène. Enfin, le tabac et le cannabis. Je dois dire que si je devais refaire cette comparaison, je crois que je la laisserais exactement comme elle est. Bien entendu, le rapport n'avait aucune intention législative, et c'était parfaitement clair. Nous étions en période d'élection, et le rapport a été utilisé de manière scandaleusement manichéenne pour fustiger